Anyways, so tonight, last week we looked at the history uh, of our people, and really one of the only sources we have for the history is the Bible, and we also have archaeology. And I kind of shared a chart of what is archaeologically able to be proven versus what's in the Torah, and kind of where they align and where they veer off. Today, we're talking about history that is in the end parts of the last chronological parts of the Bible. We're looking at the rise of the empires and how Judaism fared under the empires, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and then the Persians. Next week we'll talk about the Greeks and Romans. Um, we kind of assume that it was always bad, like whenever Judaism came up against an empire, that it wasn't good because the empire would kind of conquer it, conquer everybody and then take over. But there were quite a few empires that were very tolerant with religion, with regards to religion, as long as that religion didn't interfere with collecting money, right? As long as people paid their taxes and didn't get rebellious, most empires were pretty cool with people's religious beliefs. Again, as long as it didn't interfere with business. For the most part, most of these empires were pretty religiously tolerant. Sometimes they'd institute a special sacrifice or a special offering or an idol for their emperor, which for Jews was sometimes problematic, and definitely got them in trouble sometimes. But for the most part, there were compromises and allowances that allowed Jews to not really have a problem with empires. But today, we're going to start with the empire that we first come into contact with that's a true empire, the first true empire, which is the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrians, as we read in the Bible, go to war against us, and we actually have the Assyrian version of this. But I'm going to show you what we have in oh wait, so before I show you this, Elise just put in here in the chat that she was able to learn a little bit about Israel's health tech sector recently. So, Elise, I'm glad you got to see that too. I promise you, folks, whenever stuff comes up about that, I definitely want to share it. But when we talk about the ancient history of our people, um, we oftentimes, like, our first thing we do when we go back far enough, and remember, the Bible is finished by about 200 BCE, we can look at stuff that's in the Bible and see what's there. And I'm going to show you right now what is there from uh, the Assyrian Empire. And um, we know that the Assyrians, actually, let me show you, before I show you the Assyrians, I'm going to show what we say about them. We know that the Assyrians um, came across from here, from their headquarters, their capital here in Nineveh. And what you see in green is the extent. The dark green is where they were when they first kind of were the empire, if you will. And then 671, it was the extent, how big they got. And you can see the Assyrian empire here, based in Nineveh, went all the way over through Babylonia, the Mesopotamian area here, all the way up to the border of Persia. This was Persia, which the Syrians were not able to conquer, and it went all the way up here into Asia Minor, but they weren't able to knock out these empires, or these kingdoms, I'd say mini empires, the Phrygian kingdom, the Greek city-states here, and the Lydian kingdom here. The Assyrians were not able to come into that area, but they were able to go all the way into Egypt and eventually conquer Egypt. Well, in the middle of that is our little country of Judah. And what we know in the Bible from the book of Kings, and also told in the book of Chronicles, is that in about 700 BCE, so in the middle of these two, between these two maps, between the Assyrian Empire in its early days in 820 to about 671, during this time, they went to war against us, against Israel, and they were able to capture all the northern kingdom, which was here, and they were able to completely encircle the kingdom of Judah, and they were able to wage war against it. And we know that King Hezekiah was able to survive that onslaught. And we we actually just read it. For those who were on our Tuesday morning class, we just read this. And so when you're like, oh my gosh, this sounds like we just did it. Well, we did. And the thing that we read about was Hezekiah's. Oh, let me show you one thing here. Just a very quick thing of our handy dandy chart that we always refer to, go back to, is our chart of the kings. It's during this period of time when the northern kingdom is captured and destroyed, and King Hezekiah is the king here. And one of the things that we saw was this chart that we showed recently on Tuesday, which are
Rabbi, I have a question when you have a break.
Yeah, 1 second. Let me just get this chart up. This is what we learned about during this period, which are some really important, and I'm going to share these charts as well. But we learned that Hezekiah is able to, he's a very good king. He's able to reinvigorate Jerusalem, and he's able to defeat the Assyrians. We get kind of different versions of it in the Book of Kings and the Book of Chronicles, but we do know that they're able to survive this test. The Assyrians are not able to conquer the kingdom of Judah, though this battle against Hezekiah and our ancestors was very, very difficult. And we actually have, as I've shared with you in the past, we have a picture of that, which is this right here. This is the picture of our ancestors being mounted, crucified and mounted on poles by the Assyrian army during what's called the Siege of Lachish. And for people who've heard me say this dozens of times, this is on display at the British Museum in London. You can see early pictures of what our ancestors look like, in this case, as corpses. And so we have the Assyrian version of it. We have our biblical version of it. The Assyrians don't really talk about why they had to retreat, but they talk about King Hezekiah. They talk about, as the king Sennacherib says, he had Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, but he wasn't able to capture him. And so it's not the Assyrians who, again, conquer everything. You can see everything around Israel, including northern Israel, except for Judah. They were not able to conquer this. So this is quite a miraculous act of survival for our ancestors, that they were able to survive for about another 120 years as an independent monarchy. John, yes, sorry. John?
Sorry, hold on. Sorry, I have to mute, and I got technical issues here. Hey, this is totally off. This is a little side subject, but we're always studying Jonah, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And he's going to Nineveh.
Yeah.
Nineveh is landlocked. Is there another Nineveh that we don't know about?
No.
Why is he taking a boat to Nineveh?
No,
All right, hold
you're
on. Let me get
right.
off mute and
No,
get you
you're
back
right.
on.
You're right. So the rabbis knew that. Why is he taking a boat from here to Nineveh? Well, part of the issue would have been, okay, at least he could get up to here and then follow along the coast there. So if he's in, it says he's in Jaffa, which is here, right near Ashkelon, that he went up the coast here, and then he would have gone along what we call the Fertile Crescent, right? But he's going along, he'd go along the Tigris or Euphrates River to Nineveh. Tigris is up here, but this is area where you can travel because it's green, right? It's the Fertile Crescent. You can't go across. So he could have gone north and he could have gone that way. The rabbis know that's still a very long journey, and it would be very hard for him to get from here to there. So here's what they say happens when he's swallowed by the fish. They go underwater to here. Why do they go underwater? Because the ancients believed that the waterways were connected to the oceans by underground tunnels, if you will. That all the waters, big waters, like really big rivers, I mean, they could see that a little creek wasn't that, but a big river like the Tigris or Euphrates, or a big body of water like the Caspian Sea, they believed that all of these waters were connected. And so they believed that when Jonah went under the water, when he was in the whale or the big fish, that he went underwater and came up in the Tigris and then got spit out right at Nineveh. He didn't even have, like, he doesn't even have to walk. So what the fish did actually was deliver him like an Uber to Nineveh. So that they actually believe that once he got in the fish over here, he was here a few days later. So that's in their consciousness, that's what they believed. And again, it's a great question because, like, yeah, where does that even come from that he's even getting on a boat? But John, the point wasn't that he was going anywhere near Nineveh, right? He's not trying to go to Nineveh. He's trying to get away from Nineveh. So he never needed to get on a boat to go to Nineveh, which is one of the reasons why, like, the story at least allows for a miraculous, here's how he got to Nineveh quick, because he was getting on a boat to go maybe over all the way over here, not even on the map, which is like Spain over here. So he was trying to go in the complete opposite direction, which is, yeah, by going by boat. So again, it's a good question because
Thank you.
all of it together, but that's really like, how did he get there so quick? That's how they came up with it. So I kind of shared with you the in a nutshell, the midrash on that. But let's look real quick actually at so the Jews, and specifically the Jews, Judah survives the Assyrian onslaught. But I want to get to one of the texts right from the Bible where we start to see some of this come about, which is um, after the Assyrians. So the Assyrians, we survived the Assyrian onslaught. Here's a discussion about it. The Assyrians are in the background, but what happens, of course, is that here's a quick little. I'm just going to swing back here. Hezekiah is able to survive the onslaught, and what does he do? For those who remember, the Babylonians send an envoy to Hezekiah when he's sick. After the war, he gets sick. He gets a miraculous cure. But what is Hezekiah? He's ill. Babylonians come and they say, hey, we want to check on you, see how you're doing. And Hezekiah, big shot, he takes them around the treasure house and shows them all the stuff that's in his palace that survived. Big shot, right? The Assyrians never got any of our treasures. Well, they took a lot, by the way. The Assyrians laid siege to Lachish and took a lot of stuff, but they didn't get into our treasures. They didn't get into the temple. They didn't get into my palace. And when when Isaiah, yeah, that prophet Isaiah hears it, he says to King Hezekiah, what did you do? And Hezekiah says they came from far away, from Babylon. Like they're pretty big. That's a pretty big deal. Look, they're paying attention to me. And he said, what have they seen in your place? And Hezekiah says, they've seen everything that's in my palace, right? There's nothing in my storehouses I didn't show them. And Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of God. A time is coming when everything in your palace that your ancestors have stored up to this day, 400 years, is going to be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will remain behind, said God, right? And some of your own sons, your descendants, right? They'll be taken to serve as eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And then, of course, I mean, that's like crazy. And then Hezekiah, you know what he says? Oh, thank God it's not happening in my time. It means safety is assured for me. It shows you Hezekiah was a good king, but he's not a great person. And there's something missing because not only does he not have humility, he has no sense of the future, no sense of thinking about long term. So sure enough, a couple of generations later, we get to this. About 120 years later, his great grandkids, Nebuchadnezzar. This is the end of the Book of Kings, and this is the way the Book of Kings ends. And to some extent, for those who are on our Tuesday morning journey, this is the way the Book of J ends. This is the way the J author ends. He's going to end with chapter 25. This is the last part of that history. Remember, Chronicles ends with the Jews coming back. We talked about that when we read Chronicles. Chronicles has a different agenda, and it was written about literally 120 years later, 100 years later, at least 100 years later. And here's what it says about what happens during the Babylonian siege. And sure enough, King Nebuchadnezzar moved against Jerusalem. He laid siege to it. There was famine. Again, for those of us who read this, we read it a long time ago in Kings, but we read it more recently in Chronicles. They captured King Zedekiah, who tried to get out of the city. They overtook him. They took him in chains, and they murdered his sons right in front of him. And then they gouged out his eyes. So the last thing he'd ever see in his life would be the murder of his children. And they brought him to Babylon. And it says, Nebuchadnezzar burned the house of God, the temple, the king's palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. He burned down the house of every notable person. The entire Chaldean force that was with the chief of guard tore down the walls of Jerusalem on every side. The remnant of the people that was left in the cities, the defectors who'd already gone over to the king of Babylon, the remnant of the population were taken in exile by Nebuzaradan, the chief of the guards. But some of the poorest in the land were left by the chief of the guards to be vine dressers and field hands. And then they just went through, they rampaged. They took all the treasures out of the temple, took them all out. Beautiful stuff. And they murder some of the rulers, some of the princes, and of course, they make their own person, Gedaliah, the governor, a Jew. They put as governor. They put him in charge of them. And he's a Jew. Told the people, you better behave. You better listen to what the Babylonians tell us. They're in charge now. And of course, what do they do to Gedaliah? The Jews who were there killed him. They murdered him. And they still wanted to fight the Babylonians. And they put it down. They put down every little rebellion they had, but there was no more Jewish kings. There'll never be another king from the line of David again. Because that last king, this is the way the Book of Kings ends. And to some extent, one of the authors ends with this idea that the Babylonians took Zedekiah's brother, King Jehoiachin, and he was taken into prison already back in Babylon before Zedekiah was made king. They deposed Jehoiachin, and took him into prison in Babylon, but they let him out of jail. And literally the last words of the Book of Kings, as the Jews are in exile, are the king Jehoiachin was given a regular allotment of food, and he got taken care of. That's it. That's the way the Book of Kings ends. Not exactly a happy ending, but at least people are going to survive. There's going to be life in Babylonia. And we, of course, also have the prophets like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the later part of Isaiah, we call second Isaiah, that gives hope for the people that when they go into exile, it's not going to be over, that God is going to go with them into exile. And we know that Jews found a way to keep their identity when they were in exile. And one of the most powerful texts in the Bible that tells us about that experience of going into exile is Psalm 137. Al Naharot Bavel, by the rivers or the waters of Babylon. There we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. And they said, how do we sing? How do we live? How do we celebrate when we're not in our homeland anymore? How can we do this when we're not at home? And they said, Im eshkachech Yerushalayim, tishkach yamini titbak leshoni, lechiki, im lo eskarechi. Words that Jewish people have been saying for thousands of years, because we said it in the second exile too. If I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right arm, let my right hand, let my strength diminish completely, right? Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth. If I don't think about you, even at my happiest hour, I have to remember. And I can't be fully joyous if I know that my homeland is in ruins. For 2,000 years, that's what we said. Now, that's why at a wedding, we break a glass. Because at our happiest moment, we're never supposed to be happier than we are at a wedding. We break a glass and we say, essentially, I haven't forgotten, right? I haven't forgotten you, Jerusalem. Now, the whole thing takes on a different message. And every time I do a wedding, say, thank God in our lives, Jerusalem is being rebuilt. Say that every time. And I did a wedding literally 2 weeks after October 7th. And I said, look, it's difficult now to celebrate in light of what just happened. And I just got back from Israel, literally like 2 days before that wedding. I had gone there right after. You remember, I went there. And I had seen the stuff with my own eyes. I mean, the blood was literally still on the roads. And it was hard to celebrate. It was hard to be up. But I knew that the Jewish people were going to survive this disaster, and that Jerusalem, even at that moment, was still being rebuilt and still being re-excavated and literally restored. And so I always say that Jerusalem is being restored. And I say the broken glass reminds us that there's still work to be done, and they're still suffering. And as long as Jerusalem is going to be in somebody's target, we're not there yet. We can't forget it. So there's still meaning to that, but I always say let's celebrate the fact that Jerusalem is being rebuilt and is a place to celebrate. And there's Jewish couples almost every day that are getting married in Jerusalem right now. So it's beautiful. It's a beautiful take on what was a very sad psalm, right? And so it's a pretty short psalm, right? It was a very sad psalm. And of course, there's been a lot of musical versions of it. There's a very famous reggae version of By the Rivers of Babylon, which was then turned into a fairly big version during the 70s. We looked at when we read about the Psalms, but that psalm tells us that our people figured out a way to continue on, even in exile. That God was not just in Jerusalem anymore, God was with them. And that they could still pray by the waters of Babylon. Because the question asks rhetorically, how can we sing a song of God on alien soil? But they just did. Psalm 137 was written by the waters of Babylon. Yeah. And so this grief, this loss is incorporated into our prayers. Now, I know I'm covering this very fast, and for some of you, it makes a lot of sense what I'm going through because you just read it with us in the book of Chronicles. Because Chronicles ends at this point. Kings ends at this point. Chronicles goes a little bit longer because we have a couple of books that are written after the destruction of Jerusalem. We have the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and we have the books of Chronicles, which tell us of what happens when we came back. Because we came back. The Babylonian Empire doesn't last very long. The Babylonians, in turn, are conquered by the Persians. And the Persians are able to establish a dynasty. And here's a little family tree of that dynasty. This is the dynasty of the Achaemenid dynasty, which starts with King Koresh, King Cyrus. And you can see he lives 550, which overlaps with Nebuchadnezzar, but it's really his descendants who are the ones who are able to conquer the Babylonians and establish a dynasty and an empire which is enormous. Now, I will say the family tree of the Achaemenid dynasty is a little imagined, if you will, because this King Darius, who's very important, he's the king who actually is the one who kind of wipes out the Babylonians as a threat, and then his son Xerxes, and then Artaxerxes. Yeah, this guy Xerxes, this is King Ahasuerus. Uh, these guys are maybe not related directly to these guys, but they are very important because they allow the Jews to go back, and we actually have a document which talks about that restoration. It is called the Seal of Cyrus, and it is also it's a treasure that's also in the British Museum, and it basically says not that the Jews can go back, but it talks specifically about some of the people in Babylonia that are able to rebuild their temples after the Persians destroy them. And what's interesting about it is it basically says that the Persians had a policy of letting people kind of worship the way they want to, as long as they're paying taxes and as long as they are paying their taxes and not getting out of sorts. So let me show you. This is the second. So this is the Assyrian Empire. Let me just show you this real quick. This is the Assyrian Empire. This is what I showed you before. And this is the Persian Empire. So in the middle between that is the Babylonians, but the Babylonians pretty much just took over what the Assyrians had. The Persians, on the other hand, conquer everything east of this area, their area, and then all the way to India. And then They go all the way here to Egypt, and then even further because they go all the way out here to the Asia Minor area, which you saw the Assyrians and the Babylonians weren't able to do that. And they're able, the Persians, to go all the way in here to start fighting with the Greeks. Now, that's going to be important. We'll talk about it in a few moments because that's their confrontation with the Greeks is what leads to, if you will, the rise of the Hellenistic empires. Because fighting here in this area, this here Macedonia area, that's where Alexander the Great was from. And this area here, where you've got Athens and Sparta, they're coming right into contact and into battle with the Persians. And so the Persian Empire has all of Israel, has Egypt. Now you're wondering, like, why isn't Arabia in there? It's not Arabia wasn't under Persian control. It's just, it's desert. So there's no reason for them to be here because this is nothing. This is literally desert. So they didn't have any reason to do that. Their empire followed the Fertile Crescent and went all the way in Egypt, but also goes all the way out to the Greeks. It's an enormous empire, the Persians. And so this empire is able to pick up from the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and then again become even more powerful. And again, because the Persians seem to be very tolerant of religious minorities, we have we have a Jewish version of what this looks like, which is in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and this happens to be from the book of Nehemiah, we read how when the Jewish people came back under the Persians, they're led by Ezra the priest, and also this guy who's the book is named after, this guy Nehemiah, who's called a Tirshatha, which is an Aramaic word for the governor. He's the governor. And they come back to lead the Jews back from the Persian Empire. And again, they've been exiled by the Babylonians, maybe some also exiled by the Assyrians. Some of them come back. And it says that Ezra took the Torah. He brought the teaching before the congregation, and it says literally here, the Torah, before the congregation, men and women, and all who could listen with understanding, men and women together. He read from it, facing the square of the water gate from the first light until midday. To the men and women and those who could understand, the ears of all the people were given to the scroll of the teaching. Ezra, the scribe, stood on a wooden tower made for that purpose. And it talks about the people who are next to him. And again, he reads the Torah to them, and he blessed God. And all the people said, Amen, Amen. Now, what's interesting about this, by the way, is not just that there is this public reading of the Torah, which is the first time that we hear about this, but what's also really important is that it says that when they read the scroll of the teaching of God, they translated it and they gave it sense so they understood the reading. Which means that by around this time, which is about 450 BCE, Jewish people were already not understanding Hebrew well enough. They were speaking this language, Aramaic. And so they needed help understanding what the Hebrew said. Aramaic was the language of the area. It's very similar to Hebrew, but it's not Hebrew. And so they needed help understanding because some of the words are different. Yeah, pretty wild. So they read to the people, and it's a very powerful moment. And of course, what we now have is no king. There's no king here as part of this system. Now, we've had then a shift. from a people that are organized around national identity to now being a people that have a law and their community is based around that law, based around the Torah. It's a civilization now that transcends national identity. There's no king doing this. It's being done with the blessings of the Persians. There's a representative of the Persian government who's Jewish, who's there watching it, helping it, facilitating it. But there's no king. And so again, this is a huge shift, a revolution, because not everybody comes back. And we know that because the book of Esther takes place during this time, and it takes place in Shushan, which is a nice time to remind everybody that 1 month from yesterday will be Purim. Now, we don't think about Purim as a holiday that teaches us history because, again, there's not a lot of historical accuracy in the book. We never have any historical evidence for a woman named Esther. We do know there's a king Xerxes, Ahasuerus, but he doesn't seem to be kind of like the king that's described in the book. We have no evidence for a guy named Haman. Nobody booed you. You got to get on the boo. They have no evidence for that. Evidence for Haman. I'm going to say it again. We don't have evidence for him, but we do know that these people lived at a time when they chose not to live in the land of Israel. You can say whatever you want. It was good that Mordecai became pretty powerful, right? He becomes the vizier, but he doesn't live in Israel. He didn't go. So there's going to be a diaspora, and it's a chosen diaspora for some people. So now the Jewish people build a second temple. Under Ezra and Nehemiah, they build a temple because the Torah still is very much a book that talks about sacrifices, and they want to institute and reinstitute those sacrifices. And so the priests, and in this case, Ezra is one of those priests. He wants to make sure that that temple sacrifice gets done. But Ezra was also a scribe. He's a Kohen and a Sofer. He's both. And what's interesting is that he's very important because he's both. But after his life, maybe within a generation or two, the priests and the scribes, they're not one guy anymore. For the most part, they don't like each other. And the priests eventually become what we call the Sadducees, and the scribes eventually become the Pharisees, or what we might also later call rabbis. And so these groups kind of emerge out of a single kind of entity, which are the leaders, non-political leaders, into the people who are going to kind of call the shots. Definitely have a very important job in educating and kind of shaping what the Jewish community will look like. Now, we enter a period.
Rabbi, I got a question.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Do we have any idea how many Torahs there were floating around?
It's a good question because by the time of Ezra, there's definitely Ezra has a Bible in front of him. And the belief is by the time Ezra dies, much of the Bible, the Tanakh, not just the Torah, but the Book of Kings, the Psalms, lots of these books are now books that they're canonized. For want of a better term, they're acknowledged as books that are going to be taught and considered holy. But during this period, the focus is still on building the temple. This now what will be the second temple. So during this period of time, the Persians, King Cyrus conquers Babylon. He allows the Jews to come back, and the period of time during this 25 years or so, the Jewish people start building the temple. There's going to be a priesthood, but there's no king. And during this next period of time, again, as Ezra and Nehemiah are kind of leading this, and up till the time they die, about 450, the Torah, as we just read, is read publicly. There are different versions of some of the books because we know that we have variances of them. Like some of the copies of some of the biblical books we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls are slightly different. The Septuagint seems slightly different, maybe not just the Greek, but the Hebrew that they were translating seems somewhat different than the Bible that we have. We call the Masoretic text. So there were different versions of some of these books floating around, but it's not until the rabbinic period, John, and we'll get to it, where the rabbis say, well, this book is definitely part of our Bible. It's part of the Tanakh, and the Tanakh is closed. No more. Nothing else is coming in, which of course is the book, like the books of the Maccabees. Pretty much no book is going to get in unless it deals with this period. If it comes after this period, it's not getting in. Now, the book of Esther was not written during this period, but it was written set in that period. The book of Daniel was written during this period of time, the Babylonian and then Persian period. We read about Daniel with the Babylonians and the Persians. It was really written around here, but it's set during this period. So by the rabbinic, when the rabbis are kind of deciding what's going in, nothing that deals with anything after this is getting in. If it talks about Greeks, not getting in. And that's the next group of people that take over. The Persians come up against the Greeks, and the Greeks win.
Why did they make that decision that nothing else was getting in?
Because to some extent, there's an authority, and I think we all know it. There's an authority that comes with time. I'll give you a stupid example. Who decides what is classic rock? Who decides? Well, that's classic rock. But there's an understanding that time has to elapse before something's going to be called classic rock. We've decided, yeah, it's got to be 30 years old, 25, 30 years old before we're going to say that's classic rock. I mean, it could be like the same genre of music, but it's not classic yet. And there needs to be some time that has to elapse for people to look at something and say that's valuable. You know, when does something become an antique? Like when is some tchotchke that you find an antique, and when is it a tchotchke? When is it a piece of trash? You know, is it 100 years? Is it 150 years? But you and I know if you find some tchotchke that somebody left behind from 300, 400 years ago, somebody's paying money for that. And I think we have that as a human instinct. We have this value that we assign to things that came from behind, from back then. And I think that was part of the issue, was the authority that came with kind of looking at something that comes around lately and they go, who knows whether that's going to have any value? We know we're still talking about that stuff, so it's valuable. So I think that's part of it. Part of it is just comes with time. And when the rabbis have to say it's in or it's out, it's because we're not going to comment on something. We're not going to write a midrash on it. We're not going to do a commentary on it unless it's that stuff. It's that canonized text. If we're gonna riff on it, it better be canonized. And so the rabbis really said, look, if it's not canonized, who cares what your midrash is, right? You're writing a midrash on something that we don't even consider valuable. So we don't want to see it. It's like taking a picture of something that's not valuable yet. So this guy goes around taking pictures of garbage. No, I want to see the pictures of the antiques. That's what the rabbis did. They're not going to make something, they're not going to take something out of context. They're not going to recontextualize it unless there's value to it in its original setting. And so that takes time. And it also, again, has to be done. It has to be closed. Because if you keep updating it, then where is the value to it? Again, it's in everything. It's literature. No one's going to say, oh, that person just wrote a wonderful book. It's a classic. Well, you might say it's an instant classic, but no one's going to teach it in a school until it's been around at least as long as John Steinbeck. So you know what I'm saying. I mean, we still have that impulse. Now, I always want to tell you what we actually know from the text and what we actually know from archaeology. So this is where we're at about this spot right now in what I've showed you in the text. The problem is, and I made this, by the way, I made this last night. This is a little timeline. I couldn't find this anywhere. And I'm like, I need this timeline. I want these 12 things on a timeline. And so I made this timeline. It's going to be it'll be up tonight. It'll be up on our stuff that's shared. All the previous stuff is up there on our site for the class. But I needed this because I wanted you to see what were the historical, during this 1,000 years, when Judaism really became a religion. I mean, because that's really what we're talking about here. And we're going to talk about rabbinic Judaism. We're not going, believe me, I'm not going to overwhelm you with everything, because next week we're talking about the Greco-Roman period, next Wednesday. But today, going through this period of time and going to Alexander the Great, who, again, the Greeks were able to hold off the Persians, but Alexander the Great, he conquered the Persians and he took everything that they had. And what we have then is the spread of Hellenistic culture. We have the Greek now coming across, and this is not in our Bible. Now, there is a little tiny piece of Greek. It's not really Greek, but there's a couple of words that kind of spilled in, and a little bit of this happened, was in the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel was written during this period, and it's not written with the intention of saying, hey, this is about the Hellenistic Maccabean period only. It's put into Daniel's voice, which as a prophet from 300 years before, but we can hear the Hellenistic, the clash with the Hellenistic side. Because during this time, Alexander the Great conquers Israel. He allows the Jews to continue to worship. There's a famous scene that's recounted in the Talmud that Alexander the Great wanted the people to worship him as a god. And the Jews said to Alexander, we can't do that. We don't worship people. We can't do it. And Alexander says, well, I'll kill all your priests. And the Jews say to Alexander, calm down. We got a better idea. We will name our kids after you. And we're going to be around for a much longer time than any of the other people you're conquering. And if you let us name if you leave us alone, just let us name our kids after you, a great tribute, you'll be around a lot longer than you would be if we put a statue of you. And that's why to this day, Alexander is a legitimate Jewish name. You will see Alexanders in every generation of Jews, including today's. And it's a Greek name. 100%. Everybody knows it's a Greek name. It is a legitimate Jewish name to this day. It has nothing to do with the Russians. It has nothing to do with any other time where Alexander came into popularity. It is a 2,300-year-old tradition, according to the rabbis. So.
Pretty incredible that he bought into that.
Yeah, well, it seems as though Alexander kind of knew when to when to push and when not to push. And as I shared last week, again, I wanted you to see what do we know about this period from archaeology. And just like I showed you last week, what does the Bible tell us and what do we know from archaeology? We have some of this here too, which is that the Bible tells us that when the Babylonians came in, they destroyed the temple, they exiled a lot of people, and the archaeology shows us this, that we have found the archaeological evidence for the Babylonian destruction. We found it.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I thought maybe the answer is for Alexander that maybe he was pretty smart because he figured, well, I can keep control over the Jews easier if they're naming all their sons after me
Maybe.
than if I have a statue of me.
Yeah.
Because if your sons are all named Alexander, maybe it's harder to revolt, or maybe you think about that.
Maybe, but maybe maybe he achieved what he wanted, which is they respect me, right? Well, the problem is we don't know a lot about this period because, as I said, as Gail said, hey, when does the Bible end? Well, pretty much ends, at least in what it's going to tell us narratively, during the Babylonian period, in the Persian period, Babylonian destruction and the Persian return. So we have this in the Bible. So this is all stuff that we have in the Bible up to this period, up to the 500s. But after that, well, let me finish this little chart here too, because I'm going to post this up for you, but I want to explain it. This is what the Bible tells us happens, and this is what the archaeology shows. And for the most part, the Bible is telling us about stuff that's happening during the time that it is happening, which unsurprisingly is pretty close to what the archaeology shows. So guess what? Doesn't mean everything in the Bible is exactly the way it says it happened. But as we get to the period of time of Ezra and Nehemiah, they're recording stuff that happens. And it's not a matter of, well, you know what my bubby told me? I saw it happen, or that guy told me it happened, and he was there. And so it's not like oral stories that have been in existence for 200, 300 years. These are people who know what happened, and the archaeology pretty much bears it out. In some cases, we can't find there's not necessarily archaeological evidence for it, but we know, for example, that during this period of time, what we found archaeologically was a lot of seals, a lot of inscriptions. We see what we've excavated from the Babylonian and Persian period is a situation where Jews are no longer building temples all over the place, to God even. Could be to other gods too, but they're not building stuff in that period to other gods, and we don't see those idols anymore. We don't see that. The archaeology also tells us there's not a lot of people there. There's not a lot of people living in Jerusalem. I would say that the Bible doesn't tell us that there's a lot of people there, but we got to be careful in assuming that there's a lot of people there, because the Bible doesn't really tell us that, and the archaeology doesn't tell us that. And so, for the most part, again, the archaeology confirms what we read about in Ezra and Nehemiah. So we found stuff and said, well, that just didn't happen. And we know that this was a fairly calm period in Jewish history. It doesn't really get violent and problematic until Israel gets caught between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids during the Maccabean period. But to get back to Gail's point, how do we know anything about this period? Where do we know anything about this period? It's not in the Bible. Rabbis don't really talk about it. We know about it from this guy, Josephus. Yep. That guy. And we're going to talk about him a little bit next week when we talk about the Roman period, because he lived during the Roman period. But we have some amazing histories that he wrote. Josephus was a Jew who defected to the Romans, and he wrote a wonderful book about the battles against the Romans, things that we would never know, because as we're going to see, the rabbis talked about it, but they didn't talk about it in great detail, and they weren't really concerned with the battles. Josephus was. He was a Jewish general who defected. So he knew about the Jewish army, knew about the Roman army, and he wanted to tell us about, he wanted to tell, actually, not us, he wanted to tell the Romans about how heroic the Jews were. And he's an interesting guy because some people think he's a traitor, but he was definitely very proud of his Judaism, his Jewish identity. He didn't hide from it. On the contrary, he went against anti-Semites in Rome, against historical revisionists who said the Jews really aren't that old, or the Jews were a bunch of Egyptian lepers that ran out of Egypt. And by the way, that they based that on some of what we have in our own Bible about Moses being able to make himself leprous, right? He's able to stick his hand in and bring out leprosy, and his sister gets leprosy, and there's a lot of leprosy in discussions in the Bible. It's not leprosy, it's actually a different kind of disease. But by the time of the Greeks and Romans, there was leprosy. And anyways, it's kind of crazy anti-Semitism that we have today. There was a historical basis for it that goes back thousands of years. Just crazy conspiracy theories and historical revision. But Josephus writes about this history because after he wrote this amazing history of the war called War of the Jews, about the revolt, he wrote a book called The Antiquities of the Jews because he wanted the Greeks and Romans to know how ancient and how amazing were his people. And so he wrote this history, and in that history, he covered this period. And this period really for us, without Josephus, is a dark age, not because it was a bad age. On the contrary, it was a pretty calm age for us. There weren't a lot of persecutions going on or wars going on. But we just don't know about it because it's not in the Bible. The Bible's already historically, that's done. And the rabbis aren't that concerned with it. And so we really don't have a lot anywhere. A couple of things in the Talmud, but overall, not a lot. And Josephus, for example, talks about the temple that was built by Ezra and Nehemiah during their days. And it's very interesting what he says about it. So he based it on the Bible because he knows the Bible. His history is very much based on the Tanakh. His book, The Antiquities, up through this period is almost always stories from the Torah. It's interesting, by the way, if you read Antiquities, because you get to read his take on the Torah, and he also used Midrash. So he has wonderful Midrashim that are in Josephus's story, which he had access to those Midrashim, and they're great. But he definitely had a Bible in front of him, or what was a Bible at those times, the Septuagint, or something that he was able to reference and quote. But when it came to this period of time, the Second Temple, he says, this is from his book Antiquities, our fathers indeed, when they returned from Babylon, built this temple to God Almighty, yet does it want 60 cubits of his largest in altitude? For so much did the first temple which Solomon built exceed this temple, nor let anyone condemn our fathers for their negligence or want of piety herein, for it was not their fault that the temple was no higher. For there were Cyrus and Darius, the son of Hystaspes, who determined the measure for its rebuilding, and it hath been by reason of the subjection of those fathers of ours to them and to their unto posterity, and after that to the Macedonians, to the Greeks, that they had not the opportunity to follow the original model of this pious edifice, nor could raise it to the ancient altitude. Do you understand? He said they didn't let us build it any bigger. The reason the second temple wasn't any bigger was because the Persians and the Greeks did not let us. He tells us. Now,
But
again,
they did let us. That's an important fact.
very important. Actually, it is important. And he tells us that they let him do it now. But he's making an excuse for the fact that he knows it wasn't any bigger. Now, by the way, he doesn't need to say this. He doesn't need to tell anybody this. But number one, John is right. He did tell us this, and he told not us. He's not writing this for Jews. He's writing this for the Romans. He wants the Romans to know that the Persians let us build the temple. Because what he's doing here is he's actually making the case for us to rebuild the temple. He's actually telling us that, hey, Romans, he's telling us, by us, I mean the Romans, he's telling his audience, look, if we want to be like one of the great empires, and the Persians were the biggest empire before, like going back, they were huge. If you want to be like those empires, let the Jews have a temple. That's what they did. So he says right here, and again, everything that Josephus writes has an agenda. I mean, the guy is he's wanting to explain why he fought for his people. Okay, you get it. His people are very heroic, and what's he going to do? But he also wants to tell you, I like the Romans, right? And he says, I'm at amity with and well regarded by the Romans, who, if I may so say, are the rulers of the whole world. I will do my endeavor to correct that imperfection which has arisen from the necessity of our affairs and the slavery we have been under formerly, and to make a thankful return after the most pious manner to God for what blessings I have received from by giving me this kingdom, and that by rendering his temple as complete as I am able. Josephus is literally making the case for why the Romans have to be good to the Jews, even though they just fought a war with them.
Is there a book, Rabbi, a modern translation of Josephus you would recommend we should buy?
It's a good question. First of all, it's my dream that somebody makes a movie about this guy, because there is nobody more interesting than this guy to me in the world. He is one of my heroes because he's the ultimate survivor. I love those survivor stories, like The Last Emperor that Bertolucci did, the amazing movie Last Emperor, about Henry Puyi, who was the last emperor of the Manchurian dynasty. That's what this guy was. He is a survivor. He's the ultimate survivor. And he finds a way to survive, and he finds a way to make the case. There are not great translations of Josephus, and I'll tell you why I think it is. His books are enormous. I will look to see which. I have a bunch of different editions. I'm going to see which one I recommend as far as the Battle of the Jews, the war, the book of the war. But the Antiquities is so long that most people haven't undertaken a translation because it's just so long. Now, interestingly, by the way, the book was written in Greek. It was not written in Latin. Josephus knew Greek, and his audience, especially the educated audience of Romans, knew Greek. And so he wrote it in Greek. So the translations are translations from Greek. He did not write it in Latin. He wrote it in Greek. But thank God for him, because, and there's a few wonderful books about Josephus. Why is he important both to Jews and to Christians and to this period? Because if you want to know anything about this period, we really are indebted to Josephus on it, because especially this period that we don't know what happens. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't know. And I will show you, I made this chart too. So a lot of these charts don't exist anywhere, or they haven't existed until this moment that I've brought them into existence. Most people are not as fascinated with Josephus as I am. They actually called me that in rabbinical school. That was my nickname, was Josephus, because this guy, the people would go like, how does he, why is he talking about, and the professors, the rabbis were always appreciative of this. But to me, it's like, it's Jewish history. if you want to know this period, there's the only place you can go. And so Josephus, again, some of it we're going to talk about next week when we talk about the rabbis and the development of this place, which is kind of, again, where are we finishing? We're finishing with up to this point. But Josephus tells us about this period, and he follows what the Bible, and again, he had the Bible in front of him. He tells us again that the Jews are survivors, and they make it through exile. They come home because they have a text. They have a law. And he makes sure that the Roman Empire understands that these are law-abiding citizens. Now, they're abiding by their laws, but let's give them the credit. Let's give them credit because they're not savages. And, for him, he's telling the Romans, these are not barbarians. These are not your enemies like the Germans and some of these other, they're not Germans yet. The Goths and these other people that are at your gates. The Jewish people who you've been fighting with, and they've been fighting, man. The Jews were fighting and fighting and fighting. These are law-abiding people. And again, if it wasn't for this, we wouldn't have anything else because the Bible ends. Don't have a lot of archaeology, and he gives us this history. Josephus tells us that the priests are the leaders. He gives us genealogies, gives us the priests. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't know who these priests were. We wouldn't have their names. He's got them. He talks about how the Jews dealt with the Greek in the Greek conquest, what happened under Alexander the Great and the Hellenists. We have no other versions of this, except for a couple of weird stories like the Alexander story that's in the Talmud. We don't know anything about it. This period that happens after Alexander dies, remember, he leaves an empire in chaos because he doesn't have any heirs. His one child is killed, and his generals fight. And this period of time that we're going to finish with today, the Ptolemaic and Seleucid dynasties, the Ptolemies are Egyptian Greeks versus the Seleucid dynasty of Syrian Greeks. They fight amongst each other, and we really don't know anything other from some Greek references. We have some archaeology that we have from this period. We have coins from this period. We have some seals and some stories. But Josephus is where we learn about this. And
Rabbi.
again, yeah.
Is Josephus and Ezra?
No,
Is it the same period, the same time period?
Ezra is during the time of the Persians. Josephus is 400 years later. But between Ezra and Josephus, there is nobody else writing history. If it's not for Ezra, we don't have that history, or Ezra and Nehemiah. But if it's not for Josephus, we don't have this history. Once we get to this period, we have the books of Maccabees, which do tell us about some of this, definitely from the Maccabean side. Now, this is what we're going to finish with today. When the Greeks are, again, leaving our area under essentially warring Greek dynasties, the Ptolemies, most famous Ptolemy, Cleopatra the seventh, by the way. Yeah, she's the most famous Ptolemy. Who's the most famous Seleucid? Probably Antiochus IV, the one that we talk about from Hanukkah. We were caught between both.
Yeah, in all the movies, they never depict Cleopatra as a Greek.
Yeah,
That's
that's
who she
that's
was.
that's caused that's caused some that's caused some political and cultural debates, right? Uh, but this period of time, um, what's interesting about this is we've found um, some beautiful depictions of what people look like, not Cleopatra, uh, because the pictures that we have of Cleopatra, by the way, she definitely looks Greek, and she's not a beautiful woman, by the way. Uh, these pictures are amazingly detailed. They're amazingly um, um, they're amazingly well preserved, some of them. And I saw some of them just went on sale, actually. They sell when they go on sale, they get sold for tens of thousands of dollars. But these these are what these were the Greek Egyptians took some of their Egyptian took some of the Egyptian style stuff. They continued to mummify in not exactly the way the pharaohs did it, but they did continue to mummify people. But what they did instead of creating beautiful sarcophagi is they would oftentimes create a simple casket, a coffin, but they would paint a picture of the people on top. And look at this style. I mean, this is a realistic style that we don't see until kind of 200 years ago. This is not the Greco-Roman style. But what's interesting about it is it keeps alive what these people look like. And they look Greek or they look a little Arab, but they do not look black. And this is what Cleopatra and the Ptolemaic Egyptians look like. Interesting, right? This is what Egyptians look like. And look a little bit like Jews too, which shouldn't surprise us because um, there were hundreds of thousands of Jews that lived in Alexandria during this time. And so we know that Jews were living in diaspora there too. And they continue to find ways to keep their Jewish identity alive, both through the Torah and also through sacrifice, because sacrifices are still being done during this period of time. But the Shulman's just asked a wonderful question. What about the Sanhedrin? And what we know about during this time is that this was the high point of the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin, as you can tell by the word Sanhedrin, has it as root, synod, and it is a Greek word meaning this kind of convocation, this type of meeting. Now, we are not 100% sure of what happens with the Sanhedrin, though Josephus says there's a Sanhedrin, or there recounts this the existence of this, and also the Mishnah and Jewish sources will tell us that there's a Sanhedrin during this time that is very important for preserving Jewish law before there's a Talmud. Now, this chart, which we're going to continue on to next week, finishes with that law. But when we get to this period right here, which is where we are, we have Jews caught between these rival Greek armies, one in Egypt and one in Syria. And the Maccabees, and we just talked about this because we did a really in-depth study of Hanukkah a couple of weeks ago. During Hanukkah, we did that on Wednesday night. Definitely, you want to go back. If you weren't there, watch the session on the Maccabean revolt. We went over that. The Maccabees were able to throw out the Greek Syrians and establish for a time Jewish control of the land of Israel, at least around Jerusalem. Now, what's interesting about these Maccabees, we call them the Hasmoneans because we call it the Maccabean revolt, but it's also really the Hasmonean dynasty. These are Jewish priests who become kings. And you have the state, the political power, and the temple merged together. Now, this is not a very long period of time. That's 100 years. But during that 100 years, it doesn't go well. These Hasmonean kings and queen, for a short period of time, there was a queen, Shlomit, Salome. They are not good people. And the rabbis have a problem with them, and they have a problem with the rabbis, and they end up killing a lot of the rabbis. So the rabbis, as we talked about during Hanukkah time, they don't want to really preserve the Maccabees and the Hasmonean dynasty. They don't care for it. Not good for them. And they also, as you can understand, because we're Americans who also believe in the best way of a separation between church and state, the rabbis did not think it was good for priests to be kings. That's not the way God wanted it. They wanted to have a check and balance system. And as we read last week, if you really want to know the truth, the Bible, and at least a little part of Judaism, says we should never have kings. As we read in the story in Samuel, kings are maybe a necessary evil. So the fact that we now have priests that are kings does not work out well. And it creates a terrible situation, which by the time the Romans take over, and they take over from this, the Jews are like, get us out of this. We don't want these guys as kings. They've created a really bad system. And for this period of time, you're going to say, well, where's King Herod? King Herod is right here. King Herod only rules because the Romans say he can rule. It's the only reason why he's there. He's during this period. And we could put a little thing here that says Herod's rule, but it doesn't functionally change what's going on in this period right here, which is a complete disaster. The temple's able to continue. Sacrifices are still happening. But the system is so bad that Jews are literally killing each other. And we sometimes forget that by the time the Romans made their entry into really taking over, the Jews were like, fine, just get these people out. Yeah.
Rabbi, is that when we were in Israel in 2023 in February, I remember we went to a theater or like a movie that we saw,
Yeah.
where a Jewish family was fighting with each other.
Yeah.
You remember that? They were Jews were killing Jews. Was that about this time?
Yes, that's exactly right. And so this is what we have right here. When Josephus talks about this period of time, we know that these sects of Jews are not only in a different frame of mind when it comes to how they practice Judaism, they completely disagree with how they're supposed to be ruled. They're at odds with each other to such an extent that they are willing to kill each other.
Rabbi,
yeah,
I
and
got a
so
question.
1 second. So by the time we get to the end of this period that we're talking about right here, right up to the Roman period, the rabbis will say that the second temple was destroyed, not because the Jews were worshiping other gods, not because the Jews weren't loyal to God, but because of the hatred they had for each other. That's why God allowed the second temple to be destroyed. In Hebrew, it's called sinat chinam, baseless hatred. And so that is the deep down amongst our people today. What do we think will destroy Israel? What will destroy the Jewish people today? That type of problem, the civil war or the hatred we'd have for each other. And we saw it at a very high level in 2023, and our enemies succeeded in uniting us to a level that we hadn't been in many, many decades. And so Israel today is not without its fault lines. There's still some definite fault lines. We see some stuff going on right now in Israel between the ultra Orthodox and the non ultra Orthodox, who are saying you got to serve in our army if you want to be part of the country. You got to do some national service. You got to do something, right? This is an issue which is at the fault line in Israel, but it is not like it was in 2023. And Israel has a whole different mentality when it comes to the priorities, which again, they woke up to the fact that we don't have time to hate each other. And it's counterproductive. And probably, again, one of the main reasons why our enemies attacked us, because they thought we were so weak that we couldn't fight. And they didn't. It's a complete miscalculation. And Hamas and the enemies of Israel know that was a poor calculation. So anyways, I only want to make the point that when we talk about this right here, or another way to say it is right here, there are many forms of Judaism. Actually, doesn't say it under here, but it is very important to understand that there always has been and always will be many different forms of Judaism. And we survived one destruction, and we're going to survive the second destruction, which happens with what we'll talk about next week. Yeah, John.
Yeah, sorry. First of all, the topic matter tonight is a lot of heavy stuff. Probably, I've been doing this for a while, and it kind of all comes together. The Ezra and Josephus, it's pretty. I see what has drawn you to it, to tell you the truth. I have a bunch of questions, but we don't have time. But my one big question is, if Josephus is going to write about history that's 450 years old, what is he drawing from for his support? Right? He
Yeah.
can't, it's 450 years before his time.
Yeah.
I understand the purpose of why he
no,
did it.
it's a great,
It all makes
it's a great
sense
question.
now.
So what were Josephus's sources? So again, they're the Bible until this period when he can't do it anymore, right? So for this period, what does he use? Well, interestingly, he did use the Book of Maccabees a little bit. We know that. He had the Book of Maccabees. So he's got that, which we get in this, right? We get the Book of Maccabees, covers this period. I could have done, what books are in here, but the problem is most of it's not, because the only book that we have here is the Bible up till here. And then here we have the books of Maccabees. Now, so you ask a great question. What sources did he draw on? Now we know he had sources that we don't have. They didn't survive. We don't have them, right? So this period of time, the transition from Persia to Greece, we don't have a Jewish version of this story, but he had versions of Jewish histories that were kept by most likely priests, maybe some of these people we call scribes, but we don't know enough about them to say like how they would even organize that. But we do know that the priests kept records that he had access to. He was a priest. He knew priests. He was a priest. Josephus was from a priestly family. He was a priest. He was also a military guy, though, by the way, we're not 100% sure he was like a competent military guy, because again, maybe he was competent compared to the rest of his other people, but we don't know how competent he was, but he had access to the priestly sources that were there too. And he also had access to Greek sources. And he read and wrote in Greek. He knew Greek. he had those sources to draw on that we don't have. Now, where are those sources today? Well, there was a tremendous library nearby Israel we know of. It was the Library of Alexandria. And he definitely had access to Alexandria. He was in Alexandria. He was in Israel, obviously, and he was also in Rome, where many of those books would have been taken. Now, some of those books were also destroyed during Roman fires, including the fire that a lot of people have heard about that happened during Nero's time. So a lot of these works were destroyed. A lot of works were destroyed later on by barbarian invasions. It's terrible to think about, how many sources were destroyed because they were written on parchment and there was no way to preserve them. But he did have access to them. And it seems as though because he knew Hebrew, he knew Aramaic, he knew Greek, he knew Latin, that he was able to draw on lots of sources. And thankfully, he had access to sources that we don't know, but we don't know all the sources that he had. He refers to some of them, but he doesn't refer to definitely even he refers to a fraction of the sources that he had. And if it wasn't for Christians preserving Josephus, which we'll talk about, and if it wasn't for Christians preserving the Maccabees, we wouldn't know any of this. Yeah. Josephus was not studied by the Jews. And it wasn't just because he was a traitor. It's because Jews didn't really study history. It wasn't something that was important to us. None of this existed outside to extent of anything other than helping us understand our laws, because the historical context to it was irrelevant. If the law is eternal, if the law goes on forever, what difference does it make when it was written? What difference does it make where the historical context of it? It's timeless. So history is irrelevant. And that's the way it's kind of studied in the yeshiva. In the yeshiva, somebody once said this one guy tells a story, this one rabbi tells a story that he didn't know that Maimonides lived 1,000 years ago. He thought he was like somebody who just had lived. He didn't realize that the guy lived in 10th century North Africa. He didn't know 11th century. He didn't realize that. He didn't know because there was no context to it. There was no the historical time period the person lived made no difference, because the commentary, the insights never were based on historical relevance.
No, it's like one conversation just continues on.
Exactly. And it continues on not just in the Talmud, but in the commentaries around the Talmud. When I showed you that page of Talmud and showed you the commentaries from Rashi or the commentaries from his children and grandchildren, the Tosafos, the conversation and the commentary doesn't stop. And it doesn't matter when the people lived. We're gonna ask the question, well, when did that person live? What was their agenda? What were they thinking about? Were they writing under Christian influence or Muslim influence? Nobody cared. In the yeshiva, they didn't care. The only question was, can I learn from that? Does that insight give me a better understanding of how to implement this, how to make this part of my life? So Jewish law is the Torah, and it's not, the historical elements of it were not important. And so as we have done, we're not going to do any more because the Bible is now closed. It's all finished. But up until this time, we've been mining the Bible for history. But it ends mid-story in the Persian period. And we really don't know, if it wasn't for Josephus and a little bit in the Talmud, we wouldn't know anything about this period at all. So, next week, we're going to look at the rabbinic period, which we've been talking about. And for those who were in our Talmud class, we talked about it a lot because I wanted you to understand it. I wanted you to understand what was happening, the background to the Bar Kokhba revolt that was going on during the time of Rabbi Akiva, for example. What's going on in the Roman world is very important. And the people who have good relations with the Romans, like Judah Hanasi, one of the patriarchs, one of the guys who was an intermediary between the Jews and the Romans. These were important things, and we shared some of it, and we're going to refer back to it, because when we go through this timeline, we're going to look at this period next week. We're going to look at this last half. So we did the first half today, and we're going to do the second half this next week and talk about what comes out of this period, which is to some extent the Judaism we have today. And I don't want to say that's when Jewish history ends, but that's when Jewish history that's wrapped around the text ends. Because again, as far as people in the Orthodox world to some extent today, history ended right here. I mean, from the standpoint of like, what else needs to happen? This is here now. We don't need anything more. So understand that's, for some people, history ended 1400 years ago when the Talmud was finished. And there is nothing more you need to say after that. So we're obviously going to go beyond that. We have 3 more sessions after. We have 3 more historical sessions. We're going to do the Middle Ages. We're going to do the age of emancipation, when Jews were now forced to come into contact with the modern world. And then we have to engage in history, because for the last 1200 years, we've kind of not talked about, we've lived outside of history to some extent. And then the last session will be about Israel and the world, the Jewish world we live in today. So thank you everybody for being here for history of the world, history of the Jews part 2.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Which hopefully ended better than history of the world part 2 came out from Mel Brooks. But watch the Mel Brooks documentary. Watch the Mel Brooks documentary, by the way.
It was terrific. It was
Watch
great.
the 99-year-old man is phenomenal.
It was wonderful.
If you have any interest at all in Mel Brooks, you need to watch it. And it's very Jewish, very Jewish. It's as Jewish as you think it would be, because it's Judd Apatow talking to Mel Brooks about it. And again, we'll see you.
Now, Rabbi, that's the
Tuesday
documentary. That's
What?
the document. That's the documentary I would pay to see.
One comment that in
And
the
Elise, I owe you an email. I'm sending it out to you today. I have not forgotten. I've not forgotten.
Okay, thank
I've
you.
got stuff for you, but thank you, Elise. And yeah, sorry.
just saying that one comment in the temple we belonged to in New Jersey so many years ago, they had a scholar in residence program, and one whole weekend they had a speaker on Josephus. And I can't
love that.
Yeah, and I can't remember the fellow's name. I mean, that was his whole, field of study. And the entire weekend they discussed Josephus, and I had never even heard the name Josephus until then.
A lot of people didn't, but anybody who goes to Masada learns about Josephus. We're going to talk a little bit about him next week, because we're going to cover what he lived through. But yeah, some amazing historical times, the beginning of Judaism, the beginning of Christianity. So we'll see you folks next week. We'll be talking about that. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you.
See you
Appreciate it.
Sunday.
Night all.
See you.
Bye all.
Bye.